Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live from downtown Brooklyn, USA, where we state the obvious. It's a coup in Bolivia with super producer Matleck.
Yo.
Chief economist David Griscom.
How's it going?
On this week's program, former Ecuadorian Foreign Minister Guillaume. We're talking about the coup in Bolivia. What comes next? The current anti-austerity wave in Ecuador, and is there a next phase for the left in our hemisphere, and then, in fact, globally, as we look at anti-austerity marches ongoing in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Iran, and Haiti, across the globe. The yellow vests never really stopped in France. Then, independent wrestler David Starr, good buddy of mine, he wore Lula Livre trunks. He's going to be talking about unionizing wrestling, unionizing sport in general. Major piece of entertainment in the world, and there's a lot of workers overworked and underpaid. For the Shoutout, we have Bernie's whistleblower plan, and we have a gem, of course, with David Griscom, a jam-packed post-game where we go over the bad. A guy by the name of Yasha Monk, who's very bad, also very boring and very bad. Elizabeth Warren with her just Rube Goldberg healthcare plan. What are we doing here, folks? And Pete Buttigieg. What the hell are we doing here, folks? Jesus Christ, this is embarrassing. All that, plus an update from Chile, where massive repression is being used to suppress those protests. Young people marching through the streets with eye bandages as rubber bullets by the Chilean military have blinded so many. And an update from the UK, where Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson have just debated. Polls don't look good, but grassroots momentum might still save the UK from Tory destruction and catastrophe. And then, of course, a debunk. It's on some of the delusional press coverage of Pete Buttigieg. All that and much, much more on this week's Michael Brooks Show. And just, I realized, guys, just really quick technical note. In the outline for the Shoutout, we need to get the whistleblower page up from Bernie's site. But first, let's start by talking about Algeria. Algeria's revolution in the 1960s was one of the most significant events in global history and specifically anti-colonial history. And it also reflects some of the contradictions and limitations as well as possibilities of anti-colonial projects. I always recommend that everybody read Vijay Prashad's People's History of the Third World, where he talks about how necessary, vital, and heroic liberation struggles can often replicate basically local bourgeoisie and other forms of traditional political and economic bases. The Algerian Revolution was one of the most brutal and important anti-colonial struggles. After it won independence from France, it became a meeting place for radicals and revolutionaries. People always talk about Algiers in the 1960s, where people from Asia, from North America, and everywhere else came as hosted by the Algerian Revolutionary FLN government, National Liberation Front government, for meetings, for global coordination on revolutionary and socialistic activities. But this incredible history, just as with India, just as in some of the dynamics we see with the African National Congress, these incredible, courageous struggles that have done so much and achieved such vital victories have not always carried out the same liberatory spirit in practice. And of course, today, Algeria is a site of incredible struggle and contest from below. In 1991, there were the first multi-party elections allowed in the country. The results were canceled by the military, after a strong showing, and in fact winning showing by the Islamic Salvation Front, which promised to create an Islamic state. This, of course, feeds that sort of horrifying political tendency, which was all too predominant in modern politics, between discredited nationalist politics and reactionary religious politics that would occur in the Middle East and North Africa. This led to a civil war that would last for 10 years. In 1999, Abdulaziz Bouteflika was elected and remained president until his recent resignation. He held the old party system down in Algeria, and through a combination of natural resource experts, reconfigured relationships with the West, and some social provisions sort of held it together, this sclerotic and collapsing political institution, and increased inequality and poverty as it, like so many other governments, followed a neoliberal line. In February, protests began in major cities against Bouteflika's candidacy to run for re-election as president. He had suffered a stroke in 2013 and was rarely seen in public. The stroke left him unable to communicate easily and still retaining power. Protesters met every Friday for peaceful protests. Later, students and youth organized their own protests to be held every Tuesday. On March 26th, Army Chief Ahmed Gad Salah demanded the president step down, and on April the 2nd of this year, Bouteflika resigned. But just learning the lessons of Egypt, and in fact, also running parallel with what we've seen in Sudan, the population recognized that, or in Zimbabwe for that matter, a change of the figurehead is not a change of a regime. Protesters remained on the streets, demanding more resignations from other high-ranking officials. Interim President Abdelkar Ben Salah announces on July 4th elections. Protesters demanded that those be scrapped, seeing them as a power grab by those aligned with the FLN, National Liberation Front Party. Other important leaders were arrested or resigned in recent months as many protests started announcing their opposition to Army Chief Salah, who has remained in control largely in Algeria ever since, asking Bouteflika to resign. Asking, in quotes, as always. Protesters continue to protest upcoming elections and instead have demanded a constitutional convention. The protests have been ongoing now for 9 months, and the military is ramping up its enforcement, jailing protesters and people who fly flags, showing solidarity with the repressed Berber minority. The struggle between the military and those working to build a civilian government is an example of limits on nationalism as an emancipatory project. The FLN and other forces liberated Algeria from colonial rule, but the next phase of a socialist project in a free Algeria was limited by the military, and it generated its own nationalist bourgeoisie project at the expense of the Algerian people. Now, nationalism is a very tricky project and certainly a conversation, and certainly in an anti-colonial mode, nationalism is very positive and largely necessary. And sovereignty, whether we're talking about First Nations communities or countries in the global South who are interfered with by Western interests, sovereignty and nationalism is a very important and legitimate project. And some form of healthy nationalism can coexist with socialist experimentation anywhere in the world. That's our current political reality. But what you see in Algeria is that there wasn't a willingness for the second wave of liberation. And the second wave of liberation dismantles and confronts, or at least ameliorates, the traditional power dynamics as expressed through the class hierarchy of a colonized population or the military. And this is what so many places are still waiting on, as in South Africa, where the African National Congress has, through being forced by the international system financially in the 1990s, and then more recently succumbing to state corruption, has delayed its own second liberation. That's how the project is fulfilled, and this is the contradiction that Vijay Prashad and others have identified. We'll be continuing to cover Algeria in the coming months. Do you guys have anything you want to add to that?
Just real quick, I think that it's really important for people who are curious about these issues about nationalism and its anti-colonial project to really heed the words and writings of Frantz Fanon. There's a phenomenal chapter in The Wretched of the Earth called On the Pitfalls of National Consciousness, where he was writing from Algeria, actually warning against these kind of trends, where what happens is you evacuate, colonial government and colonial rule, but instead of it, you develop your own national bourgeoisie, which ends up being completely detached from the vast majority of people within the nation that they reside in, and then start to actually look towards the former colonial governments, toward Western capital, in the service of only enriching themselves. Unfortunately, that has been, the case in many of these very radical countries, that really fought against some of the most brutal and nastiest aspects of colonialism. And, also to recognize at the same time, too, that it's not easy to fight against Western hegemony and fight against colonialism, and that a lot of times these governments were faced with very severe crises that were manufactured by, international provocateurs. But that, of course, doesn't, make an excuse for a continued development of exploitative relationships with the people there.
Absolutely. Matt? I just want to let everybody know, as of showtime, we went into the show with literally one ticket for Philadelphia left. So I don't know whether that's gone or not. I'm checking as we speak with the TMBS promoter, because that might be gone. All right, do we have that up, the Sanders page? Because we have to get to the shout out. Shout out, shout out, shout out.
My brain is still in recovery mode.
Shout out, shout out, shout out.
My brain is still in recovery mode.
Shout out, shout out.
From taking in so many high-level important ideas. Shout out, shout out. From taking in so many high-level important ideas. The dial of ideas. I like talking about ideas. High level. The exchange of ideas.
Shout out, shout out.
High level. Still in recovery mode.
Looking forward to sharing more ideas.
Shout out, shout out. All right, yeah, we can just open that. I've heard from, apparently I think I heard somewhere that doing things like making fun of Dave Rubin from an extremely rational source is actually like a psychopathic thing to do. So that's interesting.
It's like laughing at a mathematician doing math.
It's like laughing at a mathematician doing math. And apparently it's in contrast to doing things like writing an essay called In Defense of Torture, which is not sociopathic. So in other words, if we were to TikTok it, it would be doing things like making fun of Dave Rubin, sociopathic. Doing things like writing a column called In Defense of Torture, not. All right. Well, I guess you heard it here.
It's good to have your bearings.
It's good to have your bearings. It's good to think rationally. And it's good to keep a degree of emotional control over yourself. But with that being said, it's good to not be hysterical. But that being said, let's get to tonight's shout out. Bernie Sanders is usually in the shout out slot for this show because, again, this is an incredibly important election and we need to not fuck around and do everything we can to elect him because a lot's riding on it. But also because he keeps delivering. After assembling a strategy and a movement, he just crossed 4 million individual donors, and another piece of reporting came out that more active service members have contributed to Sanders than any other candidate, I believe, including Trump. Bernie Sanders has been putting forward a clarity we'll get to in the postgame on Bolivia as an example. Incredible plans on the Green New Deal, on rent control and housing rights that we've talked about, in addition to obviously canceling all student debt and making Medicare for all the center of a national debate, even as so many try to obscure that policy. But I want to talk about something he put on the table about a month ago, which is to use his power to stop prosecuting whistleblowers under the Espionage Act. Now, this is incredibly important. And I agree with people. Look, it's not politically wise for Bernie Sanders to talk about the Assange case specifically. But that being said, there's no doubt that the charges against Julian Assange that have been brought are a fundamental danger and threat to journalism and a free press. That the Edward Snowden not being able to allow to return home after revealing massive NSA abuse and overreach internationally and domestically is a travesty. Chelsea Manning is still being detained and essentially, in my view, I would use the word tortured because of her revelations of U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan and elsewhere. So this is incredibly important on the merits. And I'll quote now a little bit from a Ryan Grimm write-up from October 22nd. Bernie Sanders pledges to end the practice of prosecuting whistleblowers under the Espionage Act. Bernie Sanders would end the practice of using a controversial Espionage Act to prosecute government whistleblowers, the Vermont senator told The Intercept in an interview on Saturday ahead of a major rally in New York. The century-old law has largely gone out of fashion until it was deployed heavily by the Obama administration, which prosecuted 8 people accused of linking to the media under the Espionage Act, more than all previous presidents combined. President Donald Trump is on pace to break Barack Obama's record if he gets a second term. He's prosecuted 8 such whistleblowers, 5 of them using the Espionage Act, according to the Press Freedom Tracker. Asked if it was appropriate to prosecute whistleblowers using the Espionage Act, Sanders said, "Of course not." And I just want to say, this is somebody who voted against the Patriot Act when he was in the House. He's spoken out against, even as an example, there's that great throwback clip of him on Howard Stern talking about Clear Channel suppressing Howard Stern's speech when he was speaking out against the George W. Bush administration. I think more broadly, this fits into, first of all, a global crackdown on the free press, including inside the Western system, which is incredibly dangerous, the United States and the UK and Australia. But it also reflects more broadly a good civil libertarian streak that Bernie has and we should all have and we should all defend. You should not want government surveillance or private corporate surveillance to be the answer to structural and societal problems. We have to have actual answers to those things, not things that empower corrosive and dangerous corporations or obviously massively repressive intelligence and military services. So Bernie is right on the merits, and this is something that we need to push forward to protect the free press and all of our liberties. So shout out Bernie Sanders and his step forward in reform. All right, so the pitch, guys, I'll keep it short and sweet this week, but patreon.com/TMBS, that's how you get the whole show. That's how you get the illicit histories. It's how you get the idea primers. It's how you get really a full-scale global political education to the extent we can pull it off. You will be grounded in information either that is covered widely, that we're going to give you way better context analysis and history for, or things that are embarrassingly underreported, whether we're talking about Brazil or Haiti or Jamaica, or the broader thematic understandings of where we are in today's world. I mean, just this Sunday, Drew Mikael, my friend and fellow at Queen's University, is in Beirut right now, contextualizing the anti-austerity demonstrations, talking about how it exposes the structural flaws in the Lebanese political system, lessons for us and some of our own pitfalls in terms of how some people are conceiving of identity politics, and then a broader analysis of how this affects Iranian geostrategic calculations and the anti-austerity protests rising in Iran. The post games are hilarious. I get texts. I was incredibly flattered, and I think he'll be a guest on the show next month. And Judah Freelander hit us up on tweet it out. Nando Vila, you were great on that TMBS. Well, you would know that Nando, of course, as he is great everywhere, was great on the TMBS post game, and we had a lot of fun, and we did a lot of Bill Maher impressions. Okay,
more people talking.
More people. We talked about Castro and Diego Maradona, and well, actually, apropos, we got to obviously there was Fartgate with Sawell and Chris Matthews. Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan would sit down. And they would both just let one go together. And, you don't see that. That's sort of, but they both, and then, Tip said, look.
At least it was dry.
At least it was dry. Tip says yours one's wet, mine one's dry, but honestly, we both have to sit down and, and cut Social Security. And well, that was what they did there. But anyways, Bobby Kennedy. So patreon.com/TMBS. That's how this whole show happens. We are 99.9% supported by you. Merch, our website for merch will be up next week. Or 2 weeks at the latest. It's coming in December. We're incredibly excited. I was just putting the finishing touches on that out in LA. Also, I'm going to check right now. Is there one ticket left? Is there one ticket left? Let me text right now.
Better hurry.
You better. I would go try right now. Philly live show. Is there one ticket left? Okay. That's, of course, at the World Cafe. But don't worry if you miss out this time. We've got some other dates to announce very quickly. Now, the last thing I'll say, okay, and this Friday at the Verso Loft, I'm moderating a panel, hosting a panel with Matt Karp and Crystal Ball called Who's Afraid of Bernie Sanders? Really excited about that. That's going to be a lot of fun. If you're a comrade or above patron, you support Vic Viana and Forrest and myself making these documentaries. That's really what they are. They're mini documentaries, usually based off of longer form illicit histories, which are the Sunday episodes. And what we want is comrade and above patrons who also get Skype calls with me. They get these about 6 weeks before they're released to the public. We put one out about every 6 or 7 weeks or so. They take a huge amount of work because they're really high quality production. And then we release them all in an illicit history playlist, which you can go look at the YouTube channel and watch all of them. So far, we have ones on Medicaid, on Jesse Jackson, on Jamaica gang warfare, on Brazil, and on Patrice Lumumba. And I want to share this ad right now. This is only for patrons. This is the first minute or so of one on Robert Mugabe. It's narrated by the great Bill Fletcher Jr., based off of our interview with him, produced by Vic Viana, and really proud of this as always.
The crucial issue here is whether Britain will, alongside us, lead the country to independence, or whether she alone would like to do so. And our reading of the proposals is that Britain, in fact, would like to exclude us from the process of leading the country to independence. This, of course, we cannot accept.
He was someone who played such a major role as a liberation fighter and leader, in whom people placed such immense trust, and he blew it. Mugabe was an activist. He was a teacher, and then he becomes an activist in the Zimbabwe African People's Union, which was at one point the major force that was led by a man named Joshua Nkomo. Mugabe splits along with...
Go become, if you can, do it. We're doing really, really good content there for all patrons, but those, when you're at that 21 and above level, that specifically helps. Folks, Philly's sold out. Wow. We'll see you there. We're done. Don't worry, more shows going to be announced really soon. We're going to take a brief break. We'll be right back with David Starr. We're talking about unionizing professional wrestling. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is the Bernie Sanders of professional wrestling. He's also the co-founder of We the Independent. David Starr joins TMBS. Welcome to the arena, man.
Oh, thanks. Making me feel comfortable with the arena talk. Appreciate it.
Dude, how did you become a professional wrestler? How does somebody do that? David's listening intently.
Well, I mean, I was a pro wrestling fan since I was 5 years old when I first saw WrestleMania. I saw WrestleMania 12, which was an Iron Man match between Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels. And I started amateur wrestling when I was 7. I wrestled all the way through university. And then pretty much when that was done, I had no idea what the hell I was going to do with myself. I was always told I was too small to be a pro wrestler. I wasn't, it was impossible. It's a pipe dream. But I decided, whatever, I'm just going to do it. So I went and I trained at the Wild Samoan Training Center by Samu Anawai, who was one of the head shrinkers. He was my head trainer. And then everything kind of took off. So that was almost 8 years ago.
That's amazing. So before we go any further, I love this. I mean, obviously this means a lot to the show. We'll put this up on screen. This is a photo. I guess we don't have David in them, but this is a photo of your Lula Livre trunks. And, can you talk about how Lula Livre, what got you into Lula Livre, and bigger picture, how does your politics interact with your wrestling character?
Oh, well, it was kind of, I was kind of lost into this wrestling bubble because I don't want to, I got to break this news. I know everyone's going to be a little weirded out by this, but wrestling's not real.
No.
So the outcome is predetermined.
I hope Waz isn't listening. He's going to be really upset, man.
No. Listen, I am in pain all the time. I'm constantly uncomfortable, but the outcome is predetermined. Right. So it's very easy for people to get sucked into this false reality of pro wrestling, like where you almost think that you're actually beating people and then get a bad attitude about stuff. Ego driven is a big part of it. So I felt like I was kind of getting sucked into this world a little bit more. And before I started wrestling, I was into politics on a very surface level. I watched a lot of mainstream news and stuff. So I was like, yeah, Obama's cool. And that was kind of it, but I was always interested, and it kept going deeper and deeper. And then I just realized that politics to me was just felt like a greater purpose. It had more meaning. So I decided that when push came to shove, that I could kind of use whatever platform I was given to espouse the views that I feel are better for the world. It's obviously just my opinion. Some people might think I'm a dick for it. That's okay.
Right.
That's it. Whatever, man. Go for it.
Exactly.
So, and then everything, it kind of got more incorporated into who I was as a character when I had a bunch of pennies thrown at me. I'm outwardly, unapologetically Jewish, I suppose you could say. And I had just recently visited a concentration camp when I was on tour in Germany. Right. And it really struck me. It was the most powerful experience I think I'd ever been through. And pretty much right when I got back, some fans started throwing pennies at me to heckle me. And they started they called me, you can't bleep out kike. So I
gotta say, man, as somebody who, gets some grief for pretty much finding all Jew material to be funny, I'm sitting here and I'm like, that's anti-Semitic.
Yeah, no, trust me.
It's like really disgusting. Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, I know. It was, I get it all the time, right. Even still to this day, but that was kind of the first thing. And then I just wasn't having it. So I got on the mic and kind of cussed out the guy. And then I was like, okay, it made me feel more comfortable to kind of bring it into the ring more and more and more. And then just when I had the opportunity to speak out on stuff or give my opinion, even, I decided to do it. This is kind of who I was, and it made me feel free. So I really, I really enjoy it.
What about the Lula thing specifically? I am curious. I got to say.
Lula specifically, you gotta, you can pat yourself on the back because
okay,
here you go. Your show in general, because I hadn't really heard a lot of international politics. I just kind of, I've been kind of doing more and more of a deep dive into politics since, I guess you could say in a way I was almost radicalized by Bernie.
Awesome.
In 2016.
Can you talk about that? I feel like a lot of people were radicalized by Bernie.
Yeah, no doubt. My path came from, again, I was kind of into politics. I had started, I saw what Trump was doing, and that really shook me to my core. I was like, whoa, this isn't okay.
Right.
And then I started paying attention to the Democratic side of the primary. And then on Facebook, I was fortunate enough not to get sucked down, like the Ben Shapiro rabbit hole. And I found the Young Turks and I started seeing those videos. And I saw Hassan Piker and I saw Francis Maxwell's videos and things just kind of coming up. And I just watched it. Then I became a TYT subscriber and just started watching every one of their shows. And I just got more and more into politics. Then I found the Majority Report because I also saw a bunch of those videos on Facebook as well.
Yep.
And then also, so I saw some of your stuff. And then when I started listening to your show, I got more of an international taste in politics. And then obviously that made me feel better as I started to travel more and more around the world. I started going to Europe for the first times in 2016. And then I pretty much was in Europe consistently till now. Now I live over here. So
who do you how does wrestling break down? I mean, we're going to talk about the labor rights in a second, because you're also really, you're both putting your money where your mouth is and taking, I would say, some incredible, courageous risks here. But I think I know what the WWE is, but what or a WWF, whatever. But what part of it are you in? How does it work business wise?
Sure.
What league are you in?
So there are there's corporate wrestling, which you would know is WWE,
okay.
Or there's also something called Impact Wrestling, which used to be known as TNA. There's Ring of Honor Wrestling, which is owned by Sinclair Broadcasting, but it's a major national, and I mean it's a huge. That's one of the big ones. There's a new one called AEW, All Elite Wrestling, which is run by the Khans, who I think, I don't know what Tony Khan's dad's name is, but he's a massive billionaire. They're all owned by massive corporations. So there's corporate wrestling, and then what I'm independent wrestler. So basically, a lot of times the top stars you see on the corporate wrestling level come through the independents.
Right.
And it's essentially just a bunch of small promotions that will run all over the world. I've been on shows with, I think the most people I've wrestled in front of personally is 5,000. I've done that 3 times, I believe.
Wow.
I've wrestled
awesome.
in.
That's a lot.
Yeah. I've usually on average, the average show that I perform on at this point in my career is typically it'll have at least 400 people there, or 300, 400 people there. But I've wrestled on shows even recently that have had 100 people. I've wrestled in my career in front of 2 people before. And obviously 5,000 being the maximum. But yeah, it kind of, there's a bunch of these promotions all over the world. I've been fortunate enough to travel the world on wrestling's dime.
Awesome.
I've been to Hungary. I've wrestled in Israel, wrestled in Australia, Germany, England, the UK, Ireland, and a bunch of other countries.
How does
Canada,
it work
Mexico.
with the part where, because correct me if I'm wrong, but going back to when I was a kid, I liked Ric Flair. That's what I remember about
Hell
wrestling.
yeah.
Ric Flair was awesome. But what
He's the man.
what is there's these, aren't there ongoing story arcs and stuff? So how does that work if you're not in the same league?
Well, so the idea of the reality within pro wrestling, I suppose, the stories or the fictional nature of wrestling is referred to as kayfabe. And kayfabe has been broken for the most part on a real mainstream level, when WWF at the time, now it's WWE, WWF at the time, when they introduced what they called the Attitude Era, which is basically when they turned pro wrestling to a lot more realism. Because if you saw WWF before, it was a lot very cartoony. There was a lot of colorful characters. There was like Doink the Clown. There was like
David
Repo
likes
Man.
him. Again, David's super into Doink the Clown.
Yeah, well, I tell you what, Doink Clown was dope.
That's what David tells me. I'm not familiar, but he takes it very seriously.
Good.
Yep.
So when Vince McMahon basically came out and essentially had this whole thing where he's like, we're not going to insult the audience's intelligence anymore. Listen, we're telling stories here, good guys, bad guys. We're going to bring you the most real form of entertainment we can. And it was like, okay, cool. Now it's acceptable basically to break kayfabe. So now what ends up happening on the independent level is each company kind of has, in a way, its own like kind of little bubble.
Yeah.
You know, where like their world is their world. You go to another company, it's their world, and you kind of exist within whatever universe they've set up. You know what I mean?
Oh, okay, got it. All right, yeah.
So I wrestle in London all the time, and in one London company, sometimes I'm a good guy with this one story, and then across I take the tube down 30 minutes. I'm wrestling for another company. I'm the biggest villain, and everybody hates me. It's just kind of the way.
That sounds great.
Kind of the way it works.
That sounds really fun.
It is. It's it's a dream job, man. No doubt about it. Again, like what I wanted to do since I was 5 years old. So,
awesome.
Yeah, it's sick.
So talk about We the Independent and how wrestlers are treated and this union struggle.
So, sure. We the Independent is it's a merchandising company that myself and my business partner, James Musselwhite, who is a renowned photographer. He's awesome. He gets flown all over the world to take pictures, and he's really good at it. He teaches other photographers how to take pictures. He's also really has a really good mind for just about anything. And him and I created this merchandising company that we use portions of our proceeds to pay for trade union membership for professional wrestlers.
Oh,
so
okay. This is up on screen, guys? Okay, great. This is it on screen. People can see.
Oh, sick. So in the UK, there's an entertainment trade union called Equity. And Equity has been able to serve pro wrestlers for quite a while now, but they never really did freelance pro wrestlers. It was mostly like way back in the day, there was something called World of Sport, where a lot of British wrestlers, they would join Equity, which is, again, just a trade union. It's just a union for like actors, the same thing how there's like SAG-AFTRA or whatever, there'd be Equity for all these other entertainers. And these wrestlers would join, but they would join based on if they did any other kind of TV appearances and stuff. And then in about 2015, 2017, they started to see if they can get freelance wrestlers, so independent wrestlers, to join. They did, but it wasn't quite there. There was like a really small behind the curtain movement to try and get people to join the union for certain union protections, but it didn't really take off. There wasn't really that much of a push for it. And on top of that, just so happened when this whole thing started happening, WWE swept in and decided to start a United Kingdom branch, and they signed up a bunch of the talent that was kind of starting to organize a little bit behind the scene. And then all of a sudden the organization just kind of disappeared. Right. The idea of doing this, no surprise. So this past year, this whole year has been pretty big for me. I've done really well. I've felt really good about everything I've been doing. I've been gaining more and more exposure. And one of the things that got me the biggest exposure was the Sinclair Broadcasting promo that I sent to you, in which I basically just called out Sinclair Broadcasting for their...
I think we have that. Let's play a minute of that. We have the Sinclair Broadcasting promo, I believe. Yeah, let's play. This is the RWHR Ring of Honor World Title Shot promo. Let's play about a minute of this, David, and then I'll throw back to you because we do have it.
Sure. Ring of Honor Wrestling is a stalwart of pure professional wrestling in an industry that is monopolized by sports entertainment. And their standard bearer, Jay Lethal, is the man that I'm wrestling. But no, I'm not wrestling you, am I, Jay? I'm not wrestling you. I'm wrestling Black Machismo. So why don't you just do it, Jay?
Why don't you just spit in my face? Why don't you just disrespect me? Because that is absolutely a complete and total joke. Something else that's a joke is that Ring of Honor Wrestling used to represent pure, independent, professional wrestling instead of representing a far right-wing, extremist, corporate propaganda machine. Do you think it was some kind of cute publicity stunt to let the little Jew boy get a flight to Israel to wrestle for your championship? Is that what you thought? Did you think that? Because no, I'm not wrestling for your championship because I'm a Jewish kid in Israel. I'm wrestling for your championship because I'm one of the best independent professional wrestlers on the fucking planet. Sinclair Broadcasting, you think you're doing me a favor by having me wrestle for your championship in the homeland? No, because it's not just the homeland for me because I'm a Jewish man. It's supposed to be the homeland for everybody. It's supposed to be a place where we can all seek peace and refuge. It's supposed to be a place that doesn't deprive its citizens of basic civil human rights. But you know what? I'll take the favor, man. I will. Sinclair Broadcasting, I'll take the bone you're throwing at me because on the morning after April 21st, you will have to wake up to your worst nightmare. You'll have to wake up to the fact that your championship is now represented by a progressive Jew named David Starr.
How did they respond to that, David Starr? And I like they did not like it.
No, they freaked out. So they complained. So basically that whole thing was set up. I was booked for an independent wrestling company in Israel called Israeli Pro Wrestling Association. And then they booked Jay Lethal through Ring of Honor, who at the time was the Ring of Honor world champion. And basically when I got booked for that match and then Ring of Honor decided to say that they were going to put the championship on the line, which was a huge deal. And they attributed a quote to me without ever talking to me, saying that it was my dream to wrestle for the Ring of Honor title in Israel, which I never said. And
that's
so I
what David said. Sorry.
So, and then basically, so when I put that promo out, they freaked out and told IPWA that I needed to pull that down immediately. It needed to be taken off, or they would pull Lethal from the show. Basically, is what they implied. They would pull him from the show, and that this small time company had already paid for his flight from America, had already paid for his hotel, had already paid his fee up front because he's Jay Lethal's like one of the best wrestlers in the world, period, and he deserves kind of like really top level treatment, to be fair. But they threatened to do all that, and then on top of that, so I decided not to really be quiet about it, and that just kind of blew the whole thing up more. And I protested outside of their Madison Square Garden show with the sign that said Sinclair is scared. And one of the things what they did is after promising that title match to the fans and everybody, they decided to change the title before the match in Israel could take place so that I wouldn't have the chance to even wrestle for their title. Wow. So that happened. So that got a lot of attention. And then I decided, you know what? I have the freedom to say the things that you're not supposed to say, because that blacklisted me from Ring of Honor. That obviously. Right. So I decided to say the things you're not really supposed to say. So going into a tournament for Progress Wrestling, which is an affiliate of WWE. Progress is an independent company in London, which is like one of the bigger independent companies in the country. And they're affiliated with WWE in that the owners of Progress run the NXT UK brand, which is WWE's United Kingdom brand. And I decided to start talking about unionizing and started talking about how WWE is kind of buying up the talent and kind of really doing a lot to make sure there wasn't many other games in town, especially as the UK scene has been flourishing on an independent level, especially. So I decided to talk about it. And the one taboo thing to talk about in pro wrestling, especially with WWE, is unionizing. You're not supposed to use the U word whatsoever. Right. So we came up with this company. We started talking to Equity, and basically we came up with this agreement where we would just start sponsoring people's union memberships. On top of that, we've also had a lot of activism in which we've pushed for certain things to change within Equity's underwritings, in which one of the things that we got done, which we're really, really proud of, this is unbelievable. We got Equity for the first time ever to include pro wrestlers in their disability welfare insurance policy. So if you're a member of the union, you are entitled to, if you get hurt and you're going to miss 2 weeks of work, you are entitled to 150 pounds a week for up to a year, which, I mean, 600 pounds a month is a lot of people's rent. Most people have flat shares or house shares. That's a lot of people's rent just paid for right then and there. And that was not even the case before. And you can add insurance on top of that that would cover you for like massive payouts. You have public liability insurance when you come to that. And that happens a lot because the fans are very close, especially in these smaller independent shows. There's also different channels, like obviously pro wrestling has, and I say obviously because it's the entertainment business. The entertainment business has this, and wrestling is just tenfold. A lot of harassment issues and like assault issues, and this gives you a channel to do that. So we've done a lot of things like that to push equity even further to protect pro wrestlers, as well as the cost is only the cost is only £10.58 a month for a union membership that we sponsor for people. It's really, we want to make it standard that once you start wrestling in the UK, you join equity and you have these protections. We want to do that. What's another? Oh, so now the other thing we've gotten done is we've made a pledge, which is basically just to have certain standards of practice set. And we're going to be releasing the pledge by New Year's. We're talking to companies backstage to see if they'd adhere to it to begin with, so that, we don't come out there with our dick in our hands.
Nice.
So one of the big things that we were pushing for was the fact that wrestlers, oftentimes, we go to these independent shows and there's not necessarily guaranteed to be water provided to us. There's not,
Jesus.
right? It's insane. There's not necessarily food that's provided to us. And oftentimes, I mean, if you're talking at an American show, American independent wrestlers, I've driven from Philly to Florida on my own and back for a show.
Right.
And you're not guaranteed food. You're not guaranteed water. Sometimes you're not guaranteed a place to stay. So we're trying to standardize all of this stuff. And we've made a lot of ground so far already. Our pledge simply says these little things, and it's really simple, is 1, you'll provide food and water to all your workers when you get there. 2, all of your agreements will be written down in text format somewhere. It doesn't have to be an official contract or anything like that. As long as it's in text format, that's legally binding, so both parties are accountable. 3, you have a qualified and competent medic at your shows. Yeah. And 4 would be recognizing the union of your workers. So those are the 4 simple pledges, and everybody, and there has been a lot of positivity around this, but there also has, of course, been pushback, as expected. Like if I'm somebody who goes as far as, and you guys, there's a lot of times people who set up the ring crew at independent shows. Oftentimes that's unpaid work. I think that every single person on a show should be paid, period. Right. I don't think that a business, if it's dependent on volunteer labor or free labor, I don't think that a business has the right to exist just because it wants to exist. I don't think that anybody has the right to make money off the backs of somebody else's labor without taking care of all of them. And there's obviously things when you could talk about like minimum wages, because the profit margins on an independent wrestling show are very thin. And I think you have to be made aware of that. And that's the truth. So I get that. Not every single person is we're not making any money that we're going to retire on.
Right.
But there needs to be standards set in place that every single person on the show is considered an equal worker, as far as they are generating profit. They're generating money for your show. They're doing some job for your show. You are supposed to take care of the people that are making sure your show operates. So we're out here fighting for every single worker, whether it's production in pro wrestling, referees in pro wrestling, the ring crew in pro wrestling, commentators, every single person that is a part of making a wrestling show go. We want to make sure they're taken care of with, again, those simple things. Your agreements in text, and it's understood by both parties. You have a qualified and competent medic there ready for your show. If something happens, as much as I said it's not real, it still is very dangerous. The falls are very real. The falls are very real. We are legitimately getting hit in the face constantly. I've had 2 concussions. I've I've wrestled on like a partially torn hamstring, and I know plenty of other people who have had plenty of other worse issues. You have to have a medic there; it just has to happen. And providing food and water for the people that are driving hours and hours and hours. Most of the people, a lot of times, you're driving 3-4 hours away from your show.
That's just insane. I mean, it seems all just so unbelievably commonsensical and basic, but it's also really interesting to learn more about this world. So we have the links for people to check out The Independent, obviously the links to people to follow you, maybe even catch you performing, and I'm sure we'll do this again. David Starr, thanks so much, man. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, man.
Awesome.
I really appreciate it.
I appreciate you taking the time. I'm gonna come check it out.
Yeah, please do. I'm in Brooklyn on December 12th, or is it 13th or 12th? One of those 2 days. I'm there with Outlaw Wrestling in Brooklyn.
We'll be there. David wants to get in the ring. All right. See you guys. See you, man. Thank you. All right, folks. We are going to take a brief break, and we are going to be right back with Guillaume Long. He's the former Ecuadorian foreign minister who served under Rafael Correa. We're talking about the coup in Bolivia and the prospects of renewing the left in Latin America. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Guillaume Long. He served as Ecuador's foreign minister in the Rafael Correa government. He's currently a senior policy analyst at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. Guillaume, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me on the show.
So I'd like to start by talking about events in Bolivia. We've been covering it on this show since the outset and a bit before, actually. Before we get to the coup and the sort of current aftermath, can you give people a sense of the Evo Morales government, what it was able to achieve, and a more, let's say, holistic view than you're going to hear about it in the conventional Western press?
Sure. The Morales government was, I think, a unique moment in Bolivian history. I think the regional context was a unique moment in Latin American history. So it's important to situate it in the context of a sort of region-wide advance of progressive governments and ideas, all sort of committed to a post-neoliberal agenda is what they called it. So an anti-austerity economic agenda, moving away from the neoliberal heyday of the 80s and 90s. So the 2000s, I would say the first 15 years of the 21st century were marked by what has often been called the pink tide. So significant growth, reduction of poverty, reduction of inequality in the region. And it's really important to understand that the Morales government really inserts itself in that logic and becomes, in fact, the Morales government becomes a champion of that logic. So you see Bolivia being one of the poorest countries in the region, having by far the fastest growth rate in the region. Well, I mean, it depends on what window of years you look at, but let's say that over the Morales government, so the 13 years of rule of Morales, Bolivia grows at double the average growth rate for Latin America, double. But it's not just growth, it's also reduction of poverty and inequality. So Bolivia is the big champion of reduction of poverty, and it's really important in the context of Bolivia, which was one of the poorest countries in Latin America. So it reduces extreme poverty by 60%. I think this is record-breaking. And it reduces normal poverty or less extreme poverty by 40%. It was a very redistributive government, which also, aside from the more material aspects of these great social advances, was also important in ethnic and racial terms. So Morales himself was the first indigenous president in the most indigenous country in Latin America, right? The most indigenous country in Latin America, Bolivia, had never had an indigenous president. So Morales was the first one, and that was very important, very symbolic. And it also meant a real, I would call it, to kind of put it in US terms, a real civil rights movement accompanied by a pro-civil rights movement government that included previously excluded sectors of society in the nation-state project. And I think that's really important because what we're seeing right now after the coup is a return of the anti-indigenous, I would say strongly racist elites, but not just elites, also middle classes, that have felt that there's been too much equality, and now all these indigenous people want the same rights and the same treatment as the rest of them, and it's created this very unfortunate and extreme right-wing backlash, which we're seeing now.
We always go back to, on this show, this example from an interview with the thankfully recently released former president of Brazil, President Lula, who maybe we'll get to a bit later. But he told Glenn Greenwald specifically said, why is there an elite backlash against you in Brazil when during your presidency, yes, the poor benefited the most, but everybody had growth. I mean, this was a win-win growth model. And Lula talked about, well, there were rich people that were basically upset. They said the airports look like bus stations. They were upset with a different class of people even just being in the airport. Not that they weren't at the airport anymore themselves, obviously. Is that some of the sort of logic that we're seeing in Bolivia?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is one of the most fascinating things that we're seeing developing all over Latin America at the moment. Certainly applies to my country, Ecuador. Yes. Some of the hardest transitions, some of the hardest policies to pass politically were the ones that were symbolically, culturally, really hard to stomach for the elites. For example, what we call in Spanish domestic workers, empleadas domésticas. Yeah, in Ecuador, when those were given the minimum wage, with social security, with all the benefits that any worker should have in Ecuador, paid leave and sick leave and all this kind of thing. This was, fiercely resisted by the elites. It's sort of the arguments that actually some slave owners used to use in this country. If you look back at the discourse in the 19th century, sort of benign slave owners saying, oh, but we treat them really well, we really like them, they're like a member of the family. Well, they don't need to be a member of the family. They need to have rights. They need to have social security. They need to be able to do something else at the weekend. And those were the kinds of things that really drew the middle and the upper classes out on the streets. I think your comment is absolutely valid. In fact, what we're seeing in Latin America right now is that the elites are a major hindrance to development. They're actually a major hindrance to the modernization of capitalism, let alone socialism or progressive sort. And what's fascinating is that I think the elites prefer inequality to prosperity. So they prefer their relative role in an unequal society than to achieve this sort of, however you want to put it, but to achieve development or this kind of great leap to a qualitatively different society. And that has a lot to do with the production matrix, the kind of plantation economy and the extractive economy, and the fact that we've had essentially rentist elites living from primary products and raw materials and commodities. I mean, there are a lot of analyses to do with that, but it's a very sad thing, and it's amazing that even these modernizers, and you mentioned Lula, he's certainly one of them, at the first opportunity. Not all elites, because again, you'd have to be more precise in your description. Well, we would have to be more precise in our descriptions, but certainly a majority of elites, as soon as they had an opportunity, we've just seen it in Bolivia, they've gone back to the old kind of semi-feudal ways of ruling their countries.
I'd like to get to Ecuador and the broader regional dynamics and maybe even global dynamics in a few minutes. But back to the Bolivia coup.
Yeah.
Can you? I think a fair amount of people watching and listening are familiar with the broad outlines of this. But can you take us through all of the kind of key steps here from the? And I'm not worried about relitigating the referendum and the Supreme Court. I mean, we could touch on that. It seems to me kind of ridiculous that that's a point of focus. But in the kind of main course of events now, there's a re-election campaign. There's an awarding of 47% of the vote, a winning of 47% of the vote, which means there's not a runoff. The OA, the Organization of American States, they question it without providing much sort of evidence, and then Morales, then there's a really accelerated process up until today, where we're seeing a coup government engaging in, killing demonstrators, putting out decrees criminalizing left politics. Can you just take us through this timeline and really ground everybody in how this coup how it happened and how it's taking shape?
Right. So, the elections took place on October the 20th. And suddenly on October the 21st, so the day after the elections, the OAS, the Organization of American States, a mission of electoral observers, released a sort of funny statement. I mean, I've done some observations for them, so I'm familiar with how they work. I've actually been the head of a OAS mission observing elections in Bolivia, so I know pretty much how it works out. And to release such an aggressive press statement the next day is unusual. Basically, the press statement said that they detected things that weren't right, and that they believed that it was better to have a second round, a runoff between the two top contenders. It's very odd, if someone's won, in democracy you win by one vote, and without giving any real explanation or evidence to somehow say, when in doubt, have a runoff, certainly wouldn't be acceptable for modern democracies. Suddenly have an international organization say, well, we're not so sure about this. Maybe you should run the elections again. So that was very suspicious. And then 2 days later, they issued their preliminary report. That's the normal thing to do. The OAS normally 3 or 4 days after the elections, they would have a preliminary report. And in that preliminary report, they made a number of accusations. The main accusation, I mean, in order not to get too technical, but the main accusation was that there was a change in the tendency of the vote. There was the interruption of the vote count on the evening of the vote, and then when the vote count was reinitialized the following day, the day after the election, suddenly there was a change in the tendency, and it was seriously favoring Evo Morales. Well, there are two problems with that assertion. The first one is that the only vote count that was stopped is the quick vote count. So, as happens in a number of countries, Bolivia has two vote counts. One, which is called the quick count, which is something that's so very speeded up. It's based on taking pictures with cell phones of the tally sheets in each one of the precincts, and it's done by a private company. And the idea is that on the night of the elections, you have a rough estimate of the election results so that the media can use and the people can be informed.
Is it kind of like, it's not the same thing, but is it sort of analogous to an exit poll?
Well, it's more precise than an exit poll.
It's more precise than an exit poll. Okay.
Much more, yeah. An exit poll is you ask people coming out of the voting booths, how they voted, and they may tell you the truth or not. And it's this is much more. The methodology is much more systemic, and it's based on the actual voting tally sheet. You take a picture and you send it to this company, and then all these people in this company, in Bolivia, it's a company called Neotech. They really speed up, in order to give you a general picture of what happened on the election night. Now, again, I don't want to go into too much detail, but Bolivia's electoral authorities had pledged before the elections that they couldn't do 100% of the vote. It was logistically too complicated. It usually is the case. Certainly, when I was in Bolivia observing elections, they didn't do 80%. I think they didn't do 100%. I think they did 70%. In this case, they said we'll do 80%, and at 83%, they stopped counting. And it's true that at 83% on the quick vote, this is the quick vote, Morales was certainly ahead. He was number one, but he didn't have that 10-point margin that you need in order to avoid a runoff. In Bolivia, in order to avoid a second round of presidential elections, you either need 50% plus one, like in the rest of the world, or, as in some countries, at least 40%. With a 10-point difference with your next contender. And he was on less than 10. Whereas the next day, when the vote count started again, Morales went past the 10-point margin. But the problem with this argument is that this was based on the quick count. And it's very unfortunate to see the media all around the world focusing on the interruption of this quick count. First of all, there was no wrongdoing. They stopped counting at 83% when they pledged to 80%. And secondly, it's the quick count. It's not the slow binding official count. The slow binding official count, the one that's not based on pictures, the one that's done by the state, by the electoral authorities of the state, was never interrupted. And it's pretty much followed what all the polls had suggested before, not all the polls, but the huge majority of polls had suggested before the Bolivian elections, essentially that Morales would have more than 40% of the vote and that he would have that 10-point margin he needed in order to avoid a runoff. So the statistical work of the OAS, the people who basically published the preliminary report was, I think, very poor. They completely forgot to mention something that happens in every Bolivian election, which is the fact that the late-coming votes, the votes that are counted later on in the process, tend to disproportionately favor Evo Morales over his contenders. Why? Because the Morales vote generally comes from the more peripheral areas, the more rural areas, the poorer areas of Bolivia, and those tend to report late. I think pretty much anybody can understand that. When you're watching election night on television, on cable TV here in the United States, sometimes they can't call a state because, such and such an area, which is known for being very pro-Republican or very pro-democratic, has, that you're going to have heavy votes in favor of one or the other, and that it's too soon to call. So that's exactly what happened in Bolivia. The pro-Morales votes came in late, and we've written a paper on this, and we've got I think graphs that are very good at explaining what happened. There's no, unlike what the OAS argued, there's no break, there's no change of trend. It's a linear, it's one line that shows that, to just simplify things, at 10% of the vote, his rival Mesa is winning, at 20% of the vote counted. They're pretty much on par. At 30%, Evo Morales is, sort of taken over. He's in first place. At 40%, that lead widens. At 50, 60, 70%, it widens further until he reaches 100%, and then he has that crucial 10-point lead he needs in order to be able to avoid a runoff. And anybody, including the OAS, could have predicted that if they looked at the areas which hadn't yet been counted. In fact, since 2005, Evo Morales' victories are late-coming victories, because it's that rural vote which, for logistical reasons, reports. The tally sheets get to the authorities later, so it's late at reporting that gives him that crucial victory. So I think it's very suspicious that the OAS did not detect that. It's very suspicious that the OAS, I've worked with them, I know them well, made a big deal out of that. And I strongly suspect that they did that for political reasons, which is why in the paper that we've written and op-eds that we've been writing all week, we denounced the OAS for being a major cause of that coup, because by saying that there was wrongdoing, they didn't use the word fraud, but then the media did. They radicalized the opposition, and protests became violent, and things got out of hand, and eventually there was a coup, and I think they played a major part in that.
Absolutely. What have we been seeing this last week in Bolivia in terms of the rights situation and the type of government? There's a lot of cynical humor that you can make of it, because in the first couple of days of the coup, there's a certain contingent, people just sort of turn these things into proxy arguments for politics in the United States, essentially, is what most people do. And some people, would sort of zero in on maybe, who knows, maybe a valid objection to Morales on an ecological policy or something. And, my sort of tendency became, I'm going to, tweet out a photo of some, the new government sort of planting a Bible or burning an indigenous flag, these obvious signs of I would say fascism, but at the very least, extremism and savagery, and then say, well, actually, if you translates in Spanish as we object to the previous government's policies in the Amazon, because people were still sort of replicating these ridiculous talking points to sort of deny what was happening. But it seems like in the last week, and this is not a good thing, because the reports out of Bolivia have been so terrifying and horrible. However, it seems like unless you're really burying your head in the sand, the clarity of the kind of government that's taking shape here is becoming very, very clear.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think there can be, first of all, there's been a huge debate in the United States, actually, about whether this is a coup or not. That's really a remarkable. Every time you have a coup, by the way, you have coup deniers, right? You had them in 1973 in Chile when Salvador Allende was toppled, and you have, and if you look back, it's never simply a military coup. Right? You always have a group of people who are arguing that it's constitutional. They find this and that reason for why the person should be overthrown, and there are always protests. And so that gives it, before the coup, that gives it a sort of, almost a legitimacy that the people are behind it or something like that. But then, history corrects some of this narrative, and I remember having debates on the coup in Honduras in 2009. There was an attempted coup in my country in 2010. The one in Paraguay in 2012. I remember exactly the same debate taking place, whether this was a coup or not. And history corrects this. We all now call them coups. Certainly, the one in Bolivia was pretty close to textbook sort of coup, right? So some middle class protest turned violent. You get more and more sort of mixture between paramilitary, vigilante, sort of right-wing protests, taking over institutions, blocking roads, so on and so forth. Then you have a police mutiny, refusing to guarantee law and order, which seriously curtails the capacity of the government to guarantee the rule of law. And then finally the army, the military stepping in saying, we call on the president's resignation. I mean, that is a coup. And then the president fleeing, actually his life was, we're now unearthing to what extent Evo Morales' life was really at threat. And then the people sworn in, having no democratic authority, no democratic legitimacy whatsoever. It's important to remember that Evo Morales won 47% of the vote, right? I mean, the OS has been trying to, argue that there were irregularities, but, they haven't really given numbers, but 47, they certainly didn't question that he'd come in first place. His closest contender was on 36. And if you look at the parliamentary elections, because there were presidential elections in Bolivia, but at the same time as you had elections in their Congress, so both Senate and lower house, in both cases, in these elections, the MAS, so that's Evo Morales' party, got a majority, right? So whichever way you look at it, Evo Morales' party won. They got a majority in Congress. They won the elections. They're the biggest party in the land, yeah? And yet, the person who's acting as caretaker president or de facto interim president, whatever you want to call her name is Janine Áñez, comes from a party that got less than 4% of the votes, right? And she's now talking of banning the MAS from running in the upcoming elections. And if Evo Morales comes back to Bolivia, she wants to lock him up and, all these kinds of things. So you're seeing an extremely authoritarian backlash institutionally. You're seeing lots of violence and repression on behalf of the security forces against Morales' supporters and the supporters of the MAS. You're seeing these symbols you were talking about of basically something that's happening all over South America. It's sort of a phenomenon you'll see in Brazil, which is the sort of hard right evangelist vote, right? So you saw it with Bolsonaro, President Bolsonaro's victory in Brazil, and you're seeing it with this coup here in Bolivia. Áñez, who was sworn in as interim president in Congress without any Congress people being present almost, and certainly no quorum to give validity to her swearing-in process, immediately went into the presidential palace with a gigantic Bible, shouting, "The Bible's back in the palace." And, there's been a real move against the Huipala, which is that flag that the indigenous people use and that had been used by the Morales administration alongside the Bolivian flag. So there are all sorts of, again, going back to the argument on racism, the current interim de facto president, Janine Áñez, was famous as a congresswoman for calling indigenous customs satanic rites. This is an extreme right-wing coup in every sense of the word, both in the way it happened and in the kind of prejudice and racism and attacks on civil rights that are happening at the moment, just a few days after it took power.
So And hopefully we'll have you. I would love to be able to host you again and continue the conversation on Bolivia. But I would like to spend a little bit of time before you go, if you can, on Ecuador.
Sure.
We speak a lot. We've covered Brazil extensively, and we've also had the privilege of interviewing Celso Amorim on this show as well. If you
good friend of mine.
Oh, awesome! It's an honor.
Saw him last week in Argentina. Yeah,
it's an honor to have both of you on. And could you tell us? Let's work from the beginning. I mean, we have talked about the anti-austerity movement in Ecuador, both trying to contextualize it in Ecuador a bit as best we can, but then also connecting it to clearly a global trend in Haiti, Chile, but also Lebanon, Sudan, Iraq, and so on. What is the story, though, going back to the president you served under? What was Rafael Correa's specific contribution to the pink tide? Maybe you could also answer, some of the sort. I think now is not the right moment to emphasize some of these objections, frankly. But there certainly was critique from of the Correa administration. However, it seems to me that this is another very clear case of radical reductions in poverty and inequality, and also an attempt to chart a non-aligned foreign policy, and now currently a very right-wing reactionary government that came in a different way in Ecuador. So could you tell us that story?
Yeah, sure. So I think there are a number of similarities with Bolivia. We've just discussed how Evo managed to reduce poverty and inequality and include previously excluded sectors of society in their nation-state project. And that was certainly the case in Ecuador. I think there are some differences as well. I mean, the pink tide, as you said, was sort of very heterogeneous. So, every leader was different, and every party was different, and every context was different, with different social forces. In Ecuador, I think there is an element which is interesting and distinct from some of the others, certainly from what was going on in Bolivia, Venezuela, and some of the ALBA states, and maybe even different from Brazil, and that there was a very strong economic side to the Ecuadorian success story. So the fact that Correa was himself an economist, I think, plays an important role with a PhD from Illinois and sort of a left-wing Chicago boy, if that thing exists. But he was, a lot of what we were doing, aside from redistributing wealth nationwide, and we achieved this through a number of things, including a massive tax reform that was really important, that didn't really significantly raise taxes, but that made people who were not paying taxes and should have done by law before, we kind of maximized tax recollection, which was always an issue in Ecuador, and that was very positive in a number of ways for redistribution. Also, we fought that practice of tax evasion through tax havens. That was also very positive. But more importantly, it reduced our dependency from raw materials, right? So Ecuador being an oil-producing state, an oil-exporting state, one of Correa's major projects was not just redistribution at home, but global redistribution, which is a pretty ambitious project. And because you don't have a global government that can tax Germany to give money to Ecuador, for example, or the United States or Japan or whatever, the only way you can have global redistribution is by changing the nature of trade. So not export bananas and import, iPhones, science and technology, pharmaceuticals, etc. Because you're always going to lose out. Not export oil in exchange for, goods with high added value. And so I think Correa's drive was to diversify the productive base of Ecuador and to really move away from that dependency from commodities and raw materials and primary economy. You can't do that in 10 years. The East Asians, whether Korea, China, Taiwan, even Japan, actually, did it pretty much. I mean, the quickest it's been done is in 30 years. But you need to start, we started that process, I think successfully. Education plays a big role, industrial policy plays a big role, all sorts of things. So I think Correa was maybe the most successful in doing that. And in that sense, Ecuador still regarded in the progressive left in Latin America as sort of a little lab for those kinds of I would say, sophisticated economic and development policies that move away, that kind of help you to move away from that peripheral status, that role in the international division of labor, if you prefer, that third world states have. So that was great. And in fact, we were starting to see the fruits of it. When the commodities prices collapsed, when the prices of oil collapsed in November 2014, from $90 a barrel to $16 a barrel, it was the first time in Ecuadorian history we didn't have a coup. The first time we paid our teachers, our military, our police on time, and we didn't have, tires burning in the streets with, great political instability. That's the problem with boom and bust cycles for those kinds of economies is when times are good, you're okay, but when the prices of oil are down, the political instability is terrible. Right. And so Correa was the first man, the first president, the first democratically elected president to hand the presidential sash to another democratically elected president in 2017. And in 21 years, it was the first time that happened. And that was a big deal. It was seen as, despite the economic crisis and the commodities decline, we'd managed to finally stabilize the Ecuador. In the decade prior to Correa, we had 7 presidents in Ecuador, right. 7 in 10 years. Right. Under Correa, 1, and he didn't seek re-election. He handed over to whom we thought was his successor. Unfortunately, from day one, this is now a well-known story, his successor, President Moreno, moved away from Correa, moved away from his electoral promises, started a major structural adjustment, neoliberal structural adjustment program with the IMF, the cutting of rights, all these kinds of things on the economic front. On international policy and foreign policy, he moved back into the sort of backyard politics with the United States. You saw what he did regarding Assange. Right. He also gave the U.S. a sort of small military outlet in the Galapagos Islands, which is a big affront to our sovereignty. A number of things. You recognize the Guaido government in Venezuela, a number of things like that. And just to finish on the Moreno a U-turn, not content with just changing policy, he started persecuting his former friends and colleagues, including former President Correa himself, who was in exile. He did this by sort of controlling the judiciary in Ecuador. It's extremely I suppose Machiavellian, clever, but very sort of unethical way of dealing with the opposition, right? By controlling the judiciary, with some media outlets that allowed him to do that, and basically by cracking down on the opposition. So now you have a situation whereby, after the big protests we had against his neoliberal program in Ecuador in the month of October, people are being arrested left, right, and center, including elected officials. The elected governor of the province where the capital is. She was elected in March. Paola Pavon's just been elected for rebellion. So yeah, now you're in a completely different zone, a zone where being a part of the democratic opposition is in itself a crime. And you're seeing a gradual transition from democracy to an authoritarian state in Ecuador. The key figures of the Ecuadorian opposition are either in exile, mostly in Mexico, or hiding, or not even hiding, but just sought refuge in the Mexican embassy in Ecuador. And the ones who have done neither of these things, are basically in jail. They've been jailed for protesting, for being part of the opposition. So quite a sad story there in Ecuador.
When you look out at this dynamic, because I want to sort of combine two questions for you in the last couple of minutes. Mm-hmm. One is, and we see obviously there was some good news electorally in Argentina. There's the really important dynamic, even though there's brutal repression, but there's movements that are, they're compelling the world's attention in Chile and Ecuador and so on. And then in Brazil, obviously, President Lula, this kind of incredible force going from being a political prisoner to back at the center of the stage. So there are these countervailing forces. And then, if we consider, it's very complicated here, obviously, but even having a main candidate like Bernie Sanders actually speaking, calling a coup example.
Absolutely.
There are these countervailing forces. So I want to know what you think the sort of prospects of renewing the left in the hemisphere are. And I'm also wondering, though, I just read an interview, I believe it was with Walden Bello, I think is the name. It was a Filipino academic. I should have had it in front of me. And he identified that there is this pattern of a sort of global enraged upper middle class. And you see it in the Trump vote. You see it in the Modi base. You see it certainly in the UK. You see it in Hungary. You see it in the types of people that would vote for Marine Le Pen in France. And you see it, maybe its most virulent manifestations in Latin America. And it is a cross between not quite elite enough to be completely insulated from declining economic prospects, particularly in relatively developed countries, but elite enough to have the type of rage that we talked about earlier at seeing people that they consider to be their social lessers of any form rising in esteem, even if in fact, like during the pink tide, the policies overall benefited them as well. So I guess I'm curious about the prospects of renewal, and also if you have thoughts strategically for this global problem of that sort of sector of the middle class and its appeal in reactionary politics.
Yeah, sure. So I think definitely there is great polarization of politics right now in Latin America. And it's an ideological polarization, left versus right, more so than in ever, even than during the Cold War. What's interesting is that the left, for the first time, governed for a significant amount of time. So the first 10, 15 years, I've said already, in the 21st century, depending on how you count them, but you had between 11, 12, and 14 leftist governments in a region in the 20 Latin American republics, right? So it was a huge majority of countries that were governed by leftist governments who moved away from the sort of neoliberal austerity, but also asserted themselves on the global stage and didn't all want to be sort of, never-ending victims of the Monroe Doctrine and sort of wanted relations with China and these kinds of things. Very heterogeneous. It wasn't all, they weren't all similar or the same, but they had a few there was a common denominator. Now, after the commodities decline, it affected a number of leftist projects. Obviously, the governments that were in power were hit by the economic decline. This is true also of right-wing governments. So if you think of Mexico, the exact reverse happened. You had a right-wing government in power, big economic crisis, the left benefited. But because it was a majority of leftist governments, the left lost out more from the commodities decline than the right, because it was governing in more places. So we've had this kind of return of the right. Now, the big mistake of the right has been to go back, to not learn from the past, and go back to these really aggressive neoliberal economic policies of the 80s and 90s that hurt Latin America so much, created so much inequality and institutional precariousness and so on and so forth. And I think what you're seeing in Latin America, these protests in Ecuador, protests in Chile, the elections in Argentina, had you not had an election, you would have probably had protests. People didn't protest because they thought, we have an election, let's express ourselves through that way, But whenever there's a choice at the moment in Latin America, you're seeing it's moving back towards the left. When there isn't a choice, as in the case of Bolivia, when it's imposed, the right manages to grab hold of power or keep power. Think of Brazil as well. If there'd been a genuine choice, if Lula had been allowed to run, he would have won the election. So my hypothesis here is the aggressive right-wing cycle will be short if it's democratic, because people, I wouldn't overemphasize this kind of middle-class argument that they all want neoliberalism. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, some do, but a lot of them don't. And if they're given a choice, they vote for the left. But if the right-wing cycle is authoritarian, then it can last much longer. There's certainly, from what you said, I think, significant lessons to be had, particularly from the accompaniment that we gave, so that the Latin American left gave, to people who were being lifted out of poverty. There wasn't enough political and ideological accompaniment. I think political parties were too weak. There was too much stress on consumption and not enough contextualization of the historical process that we were living in. And when that consumption stopped, when that growth of income plateaued, people turned against us. I wouldn't say all the people. I wouldn't say that it's irreversible, or that it's a process like some of the process you described in other parts of the world. But enough, if there was repression of the left, if Lula was in jail, if Correa couldn't be there, if with a few other tools that were used by the right, enough to mean that we were defeated or kept out of power. So I think there's a lesson there of how to accompany that transition from being under the poverty line to becoming a middle class, and not falling in the old pattern of, I'm okay now, my family's okay, so I can look down on the people who are not to make me feel better. I can reproduce the class struggle that I've been a victim of. I mean, sure, there are lots of things that we need to correct there and to think about.
Well, I hope that you will be a guest on this show again. Guillaume Long serves as a senior policy analyst at the Center for Economic and Policy Research, and he also was the foreign minister on the Rafael Correa government. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me on the show. I really enjoyed it.
Excellent. Talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye. All right, folks, we got a gem with David Griscom. I'm going to go to the postgame. There we go. I miss that music, man.
Yeah, we haven't heard in a little bit. Well, this is, this gem is really just dedicated to something that's pissed me off the past couple of days as I've been watching it. Over the past couple of months, everyone's been having a good time watching the collapse of WeWork, specifically their CEO.
Yes,
though
indeed.
He's done very well for himself, and we'll get to him in a second. But I just wanted to talk about an ongoing situation that's going on there, because we talk about these corporations a lot, and so oftentimes the people who are actually in the lived reality working at those corporations are forgotten. So WeWork was a corporation that had massive finance organizations speculating on it and trying to pump its value up. Meanwhile, there's 15,000 people that work there, and very likely a significant amount of them are going to be losing their jobs. The New York Times was saying around 4,000 people are likely to be laid off because of this massive failing with their IPO. So that's worrying enough. But then recently, the WeWorkers Coalition, which is a coalition of people who are employed by WeWork, who are trying to get a fair deal in the upcoming months, tweeted out something that was so upsetting to me to see. So around 1,000 workers who clean and maintain the buildings that WeWork uses were told that they are very likely to be let go in a very bizarre way. So what they're going to do is they're going to let these workers go, but they're going to allow them to re-sign with another company that will hire them as independent contractors.
Of course. These people.
So they have more choice.
Yeah, exactly.
They have more freedom.
Yeah, exactly. Well, they have the great choice of losing all their benefits, not having health insurance, being responsible for their own expenses, getting to work, etc. So not only is that bad enough, but the way that they're pushing this deal forward, these workers now have to either sign up with this new corporation JLL, or they will be treated as workers who quit their job, which means they won't be eligible for unemployment benefits. Now, let's also just get this straight. WeWork tries to pretend that it is a tech company, but fundamentally it is just an office space that needs workers to maintain those spaces. So in a lot of ways, these are the workers who keep this corporation afloat, and to see them being treated in this way is absolutely disgusting. Now, as this is going on, all these workers, absolutely full solidarity with them. Seeing that what's been going on has been really horrible. We also really need to recognize too that as wild as the CEO of WeWork is, there's other players, predominantly SoftBank. Some people might be familiar with them, but they are probably one of the largest funds that invest in tech companies. They've been getting massive hits recently because of all of these really disastrous IPOs. Uber and Slack were very disappointing, and obviously, seriously disappointing though, especially when when you recognize that a lot of growth in the U.S. economy has been driven by these tech companies, and all these tech companies have been floated by investment and taking on more debt. So the question is always, are these profitable or successful organizations, or are they just something that is being created by the fact that money's really cheap and there's a lot of people who are trying to pump up asset prices as much as possible? So, this has definitely been worrying. But when you look at the way that SoftBank was acting with this guy Newman, who we've all has become very clear was an absolute lunatic. Somebody who's talking about how he wants to be the president of the world.
I want to it's a community like a kibbutz, but you can make more money than the others.
There's a good recent Grubstakers episode on.
Yeah, shouts to the Grubstakers.
Oh yeah, I'm sure. I can't even, I try to jump into this guy's life story and I always I have to turn away when you start to realize the havoc that he's wreaking.
Yeah, so you learned about community from the kibbutz, but then people make the same money. It's sort of like a kibbutz, except you can do big valuation scalp.
Well, exactly. And that's the thing. So we're always told, right, by people who are very pro-capitalist that the CEOs of companies need to be compensated more because they take on all the risk. So here's somebody who took a corporation that was valued at $47 billion, saw it completely collapse when they saw what he was doing under this, behind the scenes. And now this guy is getting not just like a golden parachute. This is like they just built him a castle, right? He didn't even have to escape.
Of Grubstakers making a podcast about me.
This guy got
now TMBS is making fun of me. It's the biggest risk.
That's the risk.
Yeah, that's
the risk.
Risk is public ridicule. But I have 3,000 pair of noise-canceling headphones.
Yeah, to blare out the psychopathic ridicule.
Well, this guy...
That sounds like this may be stupid, this guy's entire existence.
So, all these workers who are very unlikely to get severance packages because of how mismanaged this company is. People have been held on for basically the past 2 months because they're trying to organize a way to get, enough cash to be able to fire people, basically. This guy got a $1.2 billion payout from SoftBank, along with a $500 million line of credit.
We need to end capitalism.
No, absolutely. When you see this, it's really, absolutely.
Capitalism is a disaster, folks. Not working.
It's a disaster. It's very irresponsible. When you talk about the amount of money that's just been pumped into this complete fraud and scam, you realize that not only is this a cruel system, as we're talking about what's being done to the workers, it's inefficient.
Fraud, let's say, allegedly.
Yeah,
Allegedly.
And we'll see what happens. The New York AG, this happened just yesterday afternoon. They're examining Adam, so maybe there'll be some legal ramifications. But this guy got paid $1.2 billion, so who even knows what it's
for cookies.
It's a lot of hard work.
Hard work.
Was he cleaning the taps?
Yeah, kettle chips at a joint working space.
Yeah.
And some of the most...
He was Windexing the cubicle windows.
What's so incredible about this, too, is it's a real estate play.
Right.
So they manage... frankly, how badly do you need to fuck up to make owning some of the most expensive or having long-term leasing arrangements in some of the most desirable real estate on earth? Somehow he made if it wasn't this whole WeWork nonsense, if it was just hey mom, hey dad, or whoever, I want to rent space. in Midtown. That would have worked.
Yeah,
like it's just it's incredible. Like you took the one resource that really is not going to be a problem, just like like prime Manhattan real estate. You'll probably be all right.
Yeah, and we'll see what happens. SoftBank, who's now owns like 80% of the company because they've just sort of bought them out. They're pretty famous for like pumping up like basically putting up valuations that are much higher than anyone is willing to pay, so that they can sort of bully anyone else from trying to get a big stake in the corporation. So maybe SoftBank's long play will work out for them. But absolutely, I mean, this guy really screwed up a pretty easy opportunity to just cash in on well, he did cash in too.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
I mean, just like
I took a good
he just screwed up for everyone else, but he did great for himself, which is pretty much capitalism.
It is hard knock life. All right, everybody, look, become a patron. We want to, at the very least, get to 3,100 by the end of the night. That's about 4 patrons left, so go do it. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody. We've got a ton to get to in the post game, including a huge amount of dunking. Next week, Milton Alamati and Nina Turner are the guests. This Sunday, a report from Beirut with Drew Mikhael. Thanks, everybody.